Hello, Michael here again with another Renderman tutorial. This week I'm going to be chatting about basic rendering workflow, some render settings that you might want to consider. This is sort of directed at people that are starting out using Renderman. So if you're already an expert on your render settings, then this might not be for you, but if you're just starting out, or maybe you just want a good overview of some rendering techniques and settings, then keep watching. This is what we're going to be talking about this week. So I've got a scene set up here. It's pretty simple. I've got some grass, I've got my small robot guy, and I've got a HDRI background with a few lights set up, just one to simulate the sun. And then I've got one for the character, then I've got an environment, omni light just to illuminate the grass, and then I've got a bounce light in the background here just so you know what's happening. I've also got on this camera a depth of field, which you can see by pressing that button there. And yeah, so what I've done is I've done a couple of different renders, and I'm going to show you what my render settings are, and then I'm going to go through the different sample rates. So you can get to your render settings by clicking this button here, and it's going to bring up this dialog box. Now there's a couple of things that are going to affect your render time. We're going to start with those. So the first thing is the resolution of your image. So I've got this, for this particular example, I'm rendering everything at 1080, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels. As you can see there, size units pixels, you could do it in inches. This, you're probably generally going to be using pixels unless you're thinking about rendering something out for print, and this might give you a better idea of what you're going to get as a result, but generally it'll be pixels. And then resolution is 72 dpi. You could go up to something like 300. Once again, this is probably more thinking about for print rather than for rendering animation or just stills that are going to be viewed on the computer. Generally 72 is going to be fine. 300 if you want a high quality image that you're going to be blowing up. You've got a couple of tabs up the top here which are talking about sampling. The two that we're going to focus on are IPR and sampling. So IPR is when you click this button here, it's what it's going to render up to till it stops rendering. So IPR is interactive rendering. So it's when you click it, you can actually move the image around in the scene. I'll show you here. Okay, so our IPR has started to render, but because it's an interactive, I can move the camera here, and this is going to be very slow because there's a lot of things happening on my computer right now, and you can see the image is updated. So I'm just going to stop that for now. So yeah, that's good if you've got. Generally, what I do is I have I've got a couple of screens set up. So what I'll do is have my renderer on my off screen, and then if I'm updating stuff in the scene, I can move the camera around to check the colors and whatnot. But yeah, so that's how that works. So 16 samples is usually going to be enough to check your colors and your light values on your render. Anything higher than that, you're sort of looking to do a final render at that stage. These other settings I would generally keep as default if you're starting out. You can sort of get into them a bit more further on down the line, so I'm not going to really explain what all this does, but generally I'd set it to path tracer and BXDF. If you've got it set to manual, it gives you a couple of other controls over the light sampling on different types of surfaces, but just set it to BXDF and it's going to basically control all that for you. So for final rendering, which is when you click this button here, this is this tab here. So our settings are minimum samples and maximum samples. The maximum is your target per pixel sample. So at 16 samples, it's obviously a low sample rate and you're not going to get a very high quality image. I'll show you all a couple of different renders of this image at different sample rates so you can see what the differences are. but you've also got a minimum samples. So essentially what this is Renderman will adapt how many samples per pixel based on like a calculation that it does, whether or not it thinks that the pixel is going to change dramatically by sampling it more times, or if it's wasting its time on sampling this pixel because it's not going to change very much by sampling it more. So say for instance, if you had max samples to 500 and minimum samples to 200, you might get an image that basically looks the same as if it was just going to sample everything at 500. So generally you could keep it at 0 and then set your max samples to, like, if you're trying to do a final and you're trying to get it nice, anywhere between 500 and 1,000 samples is usually going to get you a pretty good looking image. And it will figure out how many samples it should pull per pixel pretty well, I've found. Pixel variance for your finals, 0.005 is probably going to be fine. You'll notice on IPR it's a higher number. Basically this means that it's going to be basically a less noisy image overall, with a lower pixel variance. Incremental is so the way it renders. If you have this on or off, basically you'll notice when it is rendering, you'll get all these red squares that come up. So incremental will go through and do one pass per square, all the way around in a spiral or in lines depending on what render you're using. And then it'll go back over and do it again and again and again until it gets to your final render. So that's incremental. If you've got that off, it's just going to focus on one of those red squares until it's got it rendered all the way to your max samples, or or its adaptive sample if you've got adaptive on. So the advantage of that is that it tends to be slightly quicker, but the disadvantage is you may have an error in your render, and you might want to stop it and go back and fix something. You're not going to notice this error in the render if you don't have a preview image of the whole thing rendering up incrementally. So generally I'd recommend just using incremental, and it is the default. Integrator, generally like for IPR, I'd say path tracer, max length, basically how many bounces the light's going to take. So say for instance in this scene, I'm just going to turn off that, the light's coming out of this, it could bounce off this piece of grass here and then hit the guy, and then hit his hand, then hit his other hand, and then it's going to calculate all those light bounces until it gets to its 10th bounce. So what should your path length be? Well, the higher the path length, the longer it's going to take. 10 is the default, and if you're looking for a good final image, maybe just stick with 10. Light samples 8 and BXDF samples 8, I'd stick with that as well, and indirect samples is 1. So that's sort of bounce light from another surface that's not being directly bounced from the light source. It's sort of hard to explain, but generally you're going to get a pretty realistic image if you just keep that at 1. Caustic light in your render is basically when you get light passing through, say for instance a glass of water, you'll notice that there's like this conversion of the light rays on whatever surface it hits. So I'm going to show you an image here as an example. And so you can see all the light is converging on one point and it's creating this highlight. So that's what caustic light is. It does increase your render times dramatically. So if it is what you're after, then definitely enable it. But if you are not looking to render caustics, then turn it off and you'll save some render times. There's a couple other settings here that I'm not going to really get into. Generally as a default, if you're starting out, most of these things are going to be fine. The thing that I would look at turning on or off is denoise. If you've got a relatively medium sample rate, so like 500 is probably like medium high, you might just want to turn denoise on frame, and that can give you a better render result and save you having to boost up the sample rate to say 1,000, where with that off you'd basically get a similar looking image. So let's have a look at some of these images and compare the different sample rates. Okay, so our first image is at 1080p, it's 16 samples and it's 5 minutes, and I've got denoise set to on and all the default settings otherwise. So you see it's not a bad looking image. Because I've got a focal depth of field on the camera, you'll notice that the foreground gets quite noisy and the background gets a little bit noisy. The HDRI image isn't bad, the image is actually out of focus anyway, so it's not going to look too noisy anyway in the image. And the render time was 5 minutes. So you get a pretty good looking image for 5 minutes worth of render time, and it's going to give you a good indication of what your final, like if you want to go up in samples from there, then this is going to show you what your light values and how your colors are handling the light sources. And you're going to be able to work from there towards your final render. So let's look at the difference in time between this and 50 samples. So you can see that it tripled in time, and the difference is that there is a lot less noise already in these foreground pieces of grass, if you compare the two. But it is increasing the time by triple. So that's something to keep in mind. If this isn't your target render and you know you're going to get a lot of noise, then you might want to skip using 50 samples, because as a final, this probably doesn't look good enough for print or for whatever your final is. You want a good looking final image. So let's go up to 100 samples and see what the difference there is. So once again, the noise in the foreground has started to dissipate. And generally overall the image is sharpening up. So let's zoom in on his hand here to look at the difference in noise between 16 samples and 100 samples. So this is 16 samples and this is 100 samples. So you can see that the noise is pretty much completely gone at 100 samples. So we're starting to get a lot closer to what our final should look like. So now let's have a look at 250 samples. Now I would mention something here. It's generally better to use powers of 2 for your sample rates. So 256 would have actually been a better sample depth than 250. So just keep that in mind. And generally you're going to get a better looking, like 256 would look much better than this. It'd probably look better than 260 or 270, for example. So yeah. That's something to keep in mind. I forgot when I was doing these renders, and I already spent an hour rendering this image out. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to re-render it to show you the difference. But yes, this is a mistake that I made, and I also made a mistake on the next image with that in mind. So yeah, let's have a look. So 100 samples versus 250. 250 took an hour and 10 minutes, so it's a long render time for one frame. But the image quality is obviously a lot higher. So let's look at 100. And let's look at 1 hour and 10. Let's look at 250 samples. So once again, that noise is starting to almost completely disappear. And let's look at our final, which is 500 samples. So you can see that the noise is almost completely gone from these foreground blades of grass. On our hand, if I compare that to say 100 samples, the noise is almost, you pretty much can't see it at 500 samples. But the render time is 2 hours and 17 minutes, and I'd set this to go before I went to bed last night. So keep that in mind, that your render times are going to keep going up and up as the more samples you use. And there are tricks to getting your render time down, but generally, if you're starting out, just brute forcing it by increasing the sample rate is going to just make your renders look better without too much fiddling around. The more advanced you get with rendering, the easier you're going to find it to sort of lower your render times and keep that image quality. So low render times and high quality images is obviously always your target, because time is money. But if you're starting out, just brute forcing it, 500 samples. I should have used 512, not 500. Bad, Michael. Generally, you're going to just be able to set these to high sample rates and then set it to render, and then go to bed and wake up in the morning to a nice image like this. So yeah, let's have a look at it now for a couple of last tips before we finish this tutorial up. Okay, so here is our 100 samples render. there's a couple of things that you can enable when you're rendering just to check things out. What I like to have on is catalog, because it shows you all your renders, and inspector, which is this thing here on the right, which instead of if you don't have it on, you can always check what the inspector will say by hovering your mouse over the image in the catalog, but just having it up on the right and swapping between images generally just makes it a bit quicker. So I generally will keep that on. It just shows you what your settings were and how long the render time was and when the render started. So you can see I started this at 9:30 this morning and it took 29 minutes. So yeah, that's handy just to be able to look at on the fly. One other thing that I will show you is image color space. So your display view, generally you're going to set it to sRGB, unless you're using a different type of monitor that would require a Rec 709. But I would say most non-commercial monitors that just, if you're using it at home, I would say it's an sRGB monitor. So if you're not sure, just use sRGB. You'll probably be correct. But here we've got image color space, and it's got linear and it's got sRGB and a whole bunch of different things. And this is to do with gamma correction. I'll probably have to do a separate video about linear workflow to explain why you would use different images. But if you're starting out, the easiest way to sort of work this is just to set your display view to sRGB and set this to linear, and you're going to get a pretty good looking image. But what you'll notice though, if you went to File and Export File, and you save this out as a JPEG, you get an image that doesn't quite look like this, and I'll show you what the image would look like. So yeah, you'd get an image that looked like this, which isn't what you saw in the preview. It should look like this color space here. What's happening? Well, basically what and I'm saying that as the renderer is doing, is it's implying a gamma curve to adjust for nonlinear images. So basically what's happening is it's taking this image and it's saving it out with this gamma curve applied, because it thinks that you have already inversed that gamma curve. If none of that makes sense, basically this is what the workflow is. If you don't want this, which you probably don't because that looks like garbage, so you want your linear image, what you need to do if you're exporting as a JPEG is you need to have it know that it's going to apply the correct gamma curve to it to produce an image that is the same as the linear image that you're seeing here. So to do that, you can go to Catalog and you can enable burn in mapping on save. So what that will do now, if you go to File, Export File, and save it as a JPEG, you will see that with the image, with the burn in, it's going to give you the correct gamma curve, and I'll show you that image now. Okay, so here are both our images. The one on the left is the one that I first rendered out, and the one on the right is with the image burn in. So you can see that that is actually the correct values of light. And I can show you quickly what the difference with the curves looks like. So if you look here on our one on the left, the curves, the dark values are really high, whereas if we look at our one on the right, it's a much more even curve of light values. And what's happened here with this one on the right is, if I do this, this is the curve that it's applied to this image, which is to counteract a linear image. So it's sort of hard to explain, but basically this is what's happened. I'm going to have to do a separate video on linear workflow to explain this, but to put it simply, this is what it has done when rendering it out. But you can avoid that just by using the method that I just showed. What about for animation? Well, the best thing that you could do when you're animating is do a final render on one or two of the frames throughout the animation, and check the render time, and then you can use some simple maths to figure out what your total render time will approximately be. So this one here is at HD 540, which is 540 by 960 from memory. So it's a low resolution video. And it's also at a low sample rate. It's only at 16 samples, and I'm using denoise as well per frame. And you can see it doesn't look amazing. There's still quite a lot of noise in it, but it did take a long time to render. This is 250 frames, and I think it took about 4 hours roughly to render out. And I'll post my computer specs in the comments as well for this, so you can sort of compare them to your computer processor. But I will point out that Renderman uses your CPU to render, and it uses your GPU to denoise. So if you've got a pretty low-end CPU, your render times are going to increase a lot more compared to mine. I've got a pretty good CPU. It's a few years old, but it was pretty high-end when I got it, so it still does a pretty good job. Yeah, so that's pretty much all the basics of getting started with Renderman and your render settings. Hopefully this has sort of given you a good brief overview of what some of the settings are and how to get started to get your images looking correct, and workflows that will help you out with color management and value management as well. So yeah, if you liked this video, hit like. That would be super cool. It will help others find this video. And if you haven't already, maybe subscribe, because I do a lot of videos for Maya and Renderman and ZBrush and 3D Coat. And yeah, if you've liked this one, hopefully I could help you out with some videos in the future as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I know this is a kind of a confusing topic, and I probably wasn't the best at explaining everything, but I just wanted to keep it fairly brief. So yeah, thanks for watching everyone, and happy rendering.